So welcome to Fire Stewardship through Indigenous Stories. I will be your host, Shyann Thomas, for today. And later I will be introducing voices from Amy Cardinal Christianson and Brad Marsden. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge we are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Being of Indigenous and European descent, I will always withhold responsibility to educate myself about the history my family has lived on. Living in this generation, I am able to practice my culture, which was put to sleep inside of myself and my ancestors since colonization. With my ability to practice my culture and stand up for the sacred laws and protocols of these nations, I will continue to further my knowledge, educate our community on the responsibilities we withhold to these territories, and do my work on healing these lands. Thank you to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations for loving and caring for these lands since time immemorial. Thank you. Thank you all for coming to my first public presentation. On our agenda today, I will talk a little bit about myself, Shyann Thomas, why fire stewardship is important to me. We will touch on dendron chronology, then fire suppression's deep-rooted connection to climate change, and fire conforming / harmonious plants. After that, I will introduce Amy Cardinal Christianson, our research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, Natural Resources Canada. And then after that, we will hear voices from Brad Marsden, a residential school counselor and Truth and Reconciliation facilitator. And then at the end, we will have a question and answer section. And please feel free at any moment to use the chat box if a question arises. At the end, we will try to leave as much space as we can for questions, and don't worry, that question part will not be recorded, so no need to worry if you are a little camera shy. So a little bit about myself and how I got into this work was through Environmental Youth Alliance. Here's some cute photos of me and the crew that I got to learn with. And sorry, just flipping my paper, but through EYA, I spent 2 months doing a land-based training program. We learned employability skills. We learned about medicinal plants, invasive species, and native plants, with a lot of other useful tools to become a land steward. They are a nonprofit organization, and the work they do is incredibly meaningful and heartfelt. They really helped me bring back my connection to nature in the city, and it is just so valuable to have that. Throughout my end of training program, sorry, I'm a little nervous, but I ended up falling in love with facilitating workshops, and that is how I landed my spot at UBC as a summer intern. And my managers, they let me choose a topic to create an event on, so that is how we are here today. And a little bit about myself is I am Ojibwe and Interior Salish from the Shuswap Nation. Here's a photo on the left of my great-grandparents, Harry Bell and Susan Thomas. In the middle is Angelic Thomas and Robert Kishigweb. Robert Kishigweb is Ojibwe, so that is where I get the Ojibwe side. And then my great aunt, Elizabeth Thomas there, that is a photo from Invermere, kind of close to the Shuswap Lakes, kind of not, but yeah. And I was born on Salt Spring Island, where the Coast Salish people lived before settlement. And I have been lucky enough to live all across BC growing up. I have a really big connection to the small communities that are there and all the different ecosystems. If you look over to the right of Salt Spring, there's Main Island, which I love to call my second home. And I will be talking a little bit about that too later. So that leads us to why fire stewardship is important to me. Growing up with my connection to all the small communities all across BC, every year during wildfire season, I am so full of stress and worry for these small communities. Learning that there can be so much done to protect these communities was really struck deep with me. In summer of 2017, the Elephant Hill wildfire burned almost 92,000 hectares over 76 days. That area is 15 times the size of Vancouver. So you can see how that connects to the small communities. That could be like 20 to 30 versions of Salt Spring Island or Main Island, where my family lives. And every year we are seeing more than 40,000 hectares being burned down close to small communities. And that is due to climate change. Our lands have changed drastically in only 200 years since colonizers came and viewed fire as a destructive entity. Now our forests are overgrown, unmaintained, and they are ready to set ablaze from the land being left to itself. Currently, we are seeing small communities lost to this. As Ron Good once said, our forests, they are like a house. When you live in that house, you know what needs to be maintained, upkept. But when you don't live in that house, the house will start to fall apart. It gets dirty, old, and decrepit. That is like our forests. We need to maintain them. If for thousands of years we can date back that cultural burns have taken place, why would we keep ignoring these crucial facts? And how do we date back this to thousands of years? Into dendron chronology. Dendron equals tree, chronos equals time, and logia is the study of, which is the study of trees over time. Trees are biological indicators, providing records of averaging 400 to 1,000 years, and some even dating back to 10,000 years. I was incredibly blown away when I learned about this, how we can tell how long a season was, if it was a rainy or dry season, where there was a fire. And we can see dating back that there was cultural burns happening for thousands of years on Turtle Island. In this research, it really shows that old growth trees are so important to our communities, and it really is heartbreaking to see all of this loss and the logging that is happening. These trees are our ancestors and they hold so much knowledge. It really is a mistake to be ignoring the research that is done. Who uses dendron chronology? Archaeologists, chemists, climate scientists, geologists, forestry workers, natural resource management workers, and many, many more professions. And why is this important? Research shows that for thousands of years, Indigenous people used prescribed burns to maintain our forests, in turn reducing wildfire devastation while establishing healthy meadows and forests, which that leads us to fire suppression's deep-rooted connection to climate change. Research shows fire ecology may be the only guide in an erratic climactic future. There is no turning back, but we can change the way we maintain our forests. Humans will have to adapt with better planning, city codes, and strategies, and management. But first and foremost, we have to listen to Indigenous knowledge. Wildfires will happen, and our forests were resilient for thousands of years, but settlers changed that with fire suppression 150 years ago. Fire has been suppressed, causing more fire fields to accumulate, and connections between different forest ecosystems, creating an incredibly high risk of large, devastating wildfires. And there are over 129 million dead trees in California. That statistic is from 2019, so I'm sure there's more. We kind of have similar ecosystems, as you can kind of tell if you've ever been there, but that really is just a matchbox waiting to set ablaze. This is caused by the suppression of Indigenous forest maintenance with settler views on how our forests should look. There is no doubt that the attempted abolishment of Indigenous fire practice has caused these impacts on our forest time and time again. Indigenous practices are suppressed by colonial laws, while research proves the science behind these beneficial and crucial methods. This really does tie into our forest being a house. We need to maintain the dead trees and the underbrush. A study done by UBC also proves biodiversity is highest on Indigenous maintained and co-maintained lands. On the Swout Native Reserve, which is located on Salt Spring Island, where I was born, the Coast Salish people originally inhabited the land, and colonizers arrived on the Gulf Islands in the mid-1800s, then displacing the Coast Salish people to this location, which is one of the reasons why that Salt Spring Island still has a Garry Oak Meadow. A little bit about Garry Oak Meadows. Thank you to Ben Storms. He is the curator of the BC Rainforest Garden at UBC Botanical. So about Garry Oak, sorry. Before settler colonialism, Garry Oak Meadows played an important part in Indigenous livelihood. They used cultural burning to maintain the meadows, keep open conditions, and promote growth of berries, nuts, and root vegetables, plus creating more growth of plants for basketry, while also creating a wildfire-resistant landscape. Garry Oak Meadows were once a common ecosystem on the West Coast, and less than 5% of these ecosystems remain in a near natural condition. They are the most endangered ecosystem along with associated ecosystems in so-called Canada. Due to this, more than 100 plant species, mammals, birds, butterflies, and other insects are officially listed at risk. What does this mean? Again, we should be looking at Indigenous knowledge of how to be maintaining our forest. They really are all connected, and we are all connected too. As on this next slide, here is a small list of fire conforming / harmonious plants, and with the different forest ecosystems and how companion plants work. You can see how we really are all connected. With fire, it always brings water. When you are burning the ground, you are opening up the soil to the rainwater. You are taking out the competition. So where there's fire, there's water. And we just really need to know that we are all connected. And yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just started at the end there, but I will introduce Amy Cardinal Christianson up next.
Thanks, Shyann. Great presentation. I'll just get the next slide. Oh, perfect. So hi, everyone. My name's Amy. I'm from the Cardinal and Labakan families from Fort McMurray, Alberta, so Treaty 8 territory, and I live now in Treaty 6. I'm a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, and yeah, I'm here to just kind of give a brief overview of some of the work that we're doing and the importance of cultural burning in Canada. So next slide, please. There we go. So I think, you know, like most Indigenous people, I'm like Shyann, I'm trying to reconnect with my Métis family and some of our knowledge that was taken away from us through colonization. And so one of the ways that I've been doing that is through getting fire back on the landscape. I grew up in the north, you know, where we had fires around our community. Lots of my family were employed as firefighters. So for me, it always was almost like a normal thing. And it was only when I moved south to urban centers that I realized, you know, that people don't always have kind of fire in their areas. And yeah, so I think for me, you know, with cultural burning, it's really burning to achieve cultural objectives. And those objectives really are different depending on the nation and where you're from and what you're trying to achieve with fire. And the techniques that you use, the time that you burn is all different. And it's based on a very intricate knowledge system that each nation or firekeeper or family has of their area and how they've been able to live there sustainably. And I think one of my, you know, we see the dominant fire culture now that's all about fire suppression, you know, put the fire out, you need to be trained in a certain way, you need to wear protective equipment, you know, helicopters. It's a very masculine society, but actually Indigenous fire culture it's more of a family event. It's more about, the matriarchy. It's for me, like I burn with my family on the left. I'm actually 7 months pregnant with my second child, doing a burn, which, would be unheard of in dominant fire culture to have pregnant women out on the fire line. But the thing is, with cultural burning, we can control the smoke and control the risk and our exposure, not like what we're seeing now, where like you have no choice, we're all sitting in smoke. And on the right is another cultural burn that we're doing, but there I'm actually carrying my daughter. And so, yeah, my daughters have participated in fires for a long time. And I think that the beauty of it is, when you go to a cultural burn, there's children there, there's elders there. And one of the elders who I was talking to from Australia told me that when they returned cultural burning to their landscape, it was the first time in a while that the forest had heard children laughing in that area. It's about family and community. It's not just about fire. So next slide. So as Shyann so eloquently mentioned, we went through this cultural severance activity where Indigenous people were disconnected from fire and from other cultural practices. And I know Brad's gonna probably talk about that in more detail through his, what he's has expertise in. And, that was for us a fire suppression. So as colonizers came across, this dominant idea of protect the timber, fire is not natural on the land, get it out. And, we're seeing now more agencies and other people being receptive to having fire back on the landscape, but only in certain ways and under certain protocols basically that they allow. So, oh, just one more advanced, Shyann, there. I'll just go to the next one. Sorry, the increasing risk one. So basically what fire suppression has done really is increased our risk. So I have numerous colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service who've done all these studies looking at, how fires increase or fire risk has been increased from these suppression activities. And coupled with climate change, it's creating the situation that we're seeing now. So, one study found that the majority of communities in the boreal forest actually have a fire deficit around their communities, which means that they're at higher risk for future fires. The Mountain Legacy Project was an oblique photo comparison project in the eastern foothills of the Rockies. And they looked at pictures from the 1900s and compared them to contemporary pictures from today. And they found that there's been an increase in flammable forests. So, coniferous trees and other things. And there's been a decrease in the mosaic on the landscape that we need to make forests healthy. So, we're not seeing meadows, we're not seeing grasslands, we're not seeing as many deciduous trees. And so 60% of First Nations reserves actually are located within or intersect the wildland urban interface we call in Canada. So basically where people are at high risk to wildfire. And looking at climate change projections, reserves are actually going to face a much more frequent fire return interval. So basically how often those communities experience fire is going to increase substantially to 2050. So unfortunately, what we're seeing now is really only the beginning. So next slide, Shyann. So looking at wildfire evacuations, this graph here, it shows from 1980 to 2020, the total wildfire evacuees in Canada by year. So the blue bars are the sum of total evacuees. So you can see like the 2016 year, that was when Fort McMurray was evacuated. So that year we had over 100,000 evacuees in Canada. But if we look solely at First Nation reserves and evacuees, that's the orange bar there. We can see that some years it's been almost all Indigenous people who've actually been evacuated due to wildfire. So there's a really disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities. Next slide. So when we really look closely at the numbers, you know that 5% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous, but 34% of wildfire evacuations in Canada over the last 40 years were of First Nation reserves. And if we look at communities that have more than 50% Indigenous population, So, mostly northern communities, then it's 49% of evacuations in Canada have been of Indigenous peoples. And that's not including like a city like Fort McMurray, that's actually probably, 30% Indigenous population. So the impact on Indigenous peoples is so high. It's frustrating. I don't know how else to put it, but next slide. So, I think what I'm working for and what other people and all the nations that I'm working with is, we're really looking out, and like Shyann said, it's devastating to see what's happening on the landscape, and just see kind of these, I call them like monocultures, or, unhealthy forests that are just so prone to burning and high fire behavior. And even in the Boreal where I'm from, they're finding that some of the fires now, because there's so much fuel load on the ground, that they're burning so hot, they're actually burning the soil. And so the trees can't regenerate. So it is causing devastation in these areas. Oh, sorry. And here's my daughter to interrupt. Hey, Abby, I'm doing a presentation. Thanks. Sorry. The parenting in COVID. So yeah, it's basically burning and causing so much devastation to these areas that we're seeing almost forest conversion into deserts, which is very worrying and will have huge cultural implications. So when you hear people saying, like, oh, it's a natural, fire is natural, we should just let the fires burn. These forests that we currently have are not natural forests, it's not a good situation. So I think lots of us are working, for this reunion with fire, bringing fire back to the landscape in a good way, renewing our connection. And I think the biggest thing is, that the thing that people always like when I do media interviews, they always like to focus on like the romanticism of cultural burning. But when I start getting into the hard questions about, sovereignty, land back, all these things, people really start ignoring those things, because those are really difficult things to talk about. Yeah, it's very, they're not easy questions, but unfortunately we need to tackle them. Like if you allow Indigenous people to burn, but they only have possession of 1% of the Canadian landscape, like that's not going to do anything, right? So next slide. So one thing I just wanted to bring up that I always try to push people on, is who is the expert? We have this dominant fire culture now where people go to training and they're the ones who make decisions about what happens on our landscape. But, when I talk to First Nation and Métis elders across Canada, like their expertise is to me unmatched on how they look at fire, the knowledge that they have. And so just talking to two elders, one at Shack and Indian Band, one at Hoyston, they talk in detail about how they used to use drip torches, prior to settlement, how their ancestors used them. So they weren't the kind we see now, the metal canisters with the diesel and gas. They used sap and they used trees and other materials that they lit on fire and then drug them. So it's hard when you start to think like, who's the one that are making decisions on the landscape? And we're excluding people like these elders who have such intricate knowledge. It's basically creating what we're seeing today. So at the bottom there, we do have a podcast if you're interested on, it's called Good Fire. And it's basically, some colleagues and I, it's a very small fire community. We're sitting down and saying, how can we educate more people about fire in an easy, accessible way? So kind of came up with that podcast. And yeah, we're actually recording season 2. So if you listen to season 1, season 2 should be out soon. Next slide. I think that might be it, or is there one more? Oh yeah, this is just for information. If you're really interested in this topic, we have a book called Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship. It came out through Fire Smart Canada, and it was written by all Indigenous people, peer-reviewed by Indigenous people, features Indigenous art, and really gives an overview of Good Fire and what communities are doing now across Canada. So yeah, I think that's it for me, Shyann. So thanks so much, and I'm excited to listen to you, Brad.
How appropriate. Can you hear the fire trucks in the background? I live in Kits, and there's a lot of fire trucks going back and forth. But thank you, Amy. That was great. Some of your images really, brought me back, and I never thought of it in those terms. When you said it was a very family-oriented experience, I've never thought of this. And I remember on my reserve, as soon as spring came around, as soon as the first snow started to melt, the community, we'd all just burn the old grass, right? Because the old grass was very dark brown and damp and wilted. And so it was it brought back good memories. And when you showed images of the smoke, I could smell it. It just brought me back to childhood, right? So thank you for that. So yeah, when we talk about, when we look at what happened to Lytton, right? It's so unfortunate what happened to Lytton, and the whole town was devastated as a result of fire. And I think about it, as you're mentioning about it, I'm just thinking about, before colonization, we just had nothing but nations, right? Like I'm from the Gitxsan Nation in northern British Columbia, and we have 33,000 square kilometers within our territory, right? And our neighbors to the south, our neighbors to the north, sorry, are the Tahltan. Our neighbors to the west are the Carrier Sakani. Our neighbors to the east were the Nishka, and our neighbors to the south were the Wet'suwet'en, right? So we would have these controlled burns, right? Like whenever we would see that we're in danger in the summertime at some of these areas that were really dry, we'd have controlled burns in the winter. But now after colonization, there's this thing called property law, right? So we can't just go, we can't just do what we used to do, because now we have this thing called the law we have to abide by, right? And so it makes it really difficult. So it's really unfortunate that we're seeing all of these wildfires. And when I talk about, like, when we talk about those controlled burns in the springtime with my family, we used to do that, and I love doing those controlled burns. And as you mentioned it, I was just like, you know what, you're right. I never thought of it. You're right. That was a very family-oriented experience, and it brought back warm, good memories for me, as opposed to this what's being viewed on news today, where, oh my gosh, it's like this scary thing, right? So it's really unfortunate that laws change that, right? Where we're not allowed to be stewards of these forests, right? And so thank you for that. And what I do is I'm a residential school counselor. So I talk about the truth and reconciliation. I talk about historical trauma. And here in Vancouver, I've been doing it for the last 8 years with City Hall, right? So I've been doing it with City Hall as well as the BC Law Society. And my title of my workshop is called Fire Across the Land. And it has two meanings to it. And the fire across the land means I bring it exactly with those controlled burns in the springtime. It's about, when you remove the old, not so pretty grass, right? And when you remove that, you bring the awareness to the consciousness, Canadian consciousness, right? And so it allows for a more beautiful, regenerative growth within Canada. So that was my meaning behind Fire Across the Land, as well as, it was about, bringing light to this dark history we call Canada, and so I've been doing these workshops in Canada, and, I'm so grateful for Vancouver. Vancouver, they dubbed themselves a city of reconciliation. And I have to say that, within the workshops, my training at the City Hall, we've probably done about 3,000 to 4,000 city employees. And, Vancouver is pretty much a trailblazer in that regard. I just saw that Toronto just started theirs within the last 6 months. Well, Vancouver's been doing it for the last 6 years. So I'm very, very proud to be a part of it. And, there's a whole history there, like when I do these workshops, I sort of backed into it, and I can get into that a little bit later, but I sort of backed into it. When you grow up in a traumatized community the way I was, I had no idea about the residential school. I had no idea that my people have been traumatized for the last 200 years. When I first came out of my mother's womb, I saw all of the social conditions. I saw all of that compilation of compound negative, disempowering emotions and feelings, right? So, I had nothing. I sort of thought I knew something was going on, because we weren't like anybody else growing up, and there were so many, bad things said about us, stereotypes. And so, but I didn't have a word for it, right? I didn't have a word. I couldn't put my finger on it. I just sort of adapted to that new world that I was brought into. And when I talk in my workshops, I talk about these two invisible forces, right? That helped shape who I thought I was. And they were, they were a loss of parenting. So when we look at the residential school, this mandated policy of every child between the ages of 5 and 16 have to go to residential schools, so I look at that, the loss of parenting, as a result, the loss of parenting, and as well, the systemic discrimination. Like when we talk about Stephen Harper's apology in 2008, where was this information in 1920 and 1940 and 1960? Would it have helped? Where was this information? Why was it kept out of the collective Canadian consciousness? You see, Canada had no idea about us. We didn't even have any idea about us, because like I said, no one was there to tell me or to help me make sense out of my experience. And so when I look at that, where was our information in the university textbooks, the college textbooks, the educational resources? So when we look at that part of Canada's system called the education system, why was our people's existence erased, right? And so that's sort of what I talk about with the residential school and the historical trauma workshops that I do. And yeah, it's really unfortunate, as I was mentioning, I heard Shyann say something about, trying to reconnect, right? And, growing up in small town Canada and small town reserve, you go into town and, because they didn't have any real education on our people, the only information that they had about us was through stereotypes, right? If there's no information in the educational resources, unfortunately, you have to turn to stereotypes to make sense out of this demographic, First Nations people. And, when I go into small town Canada, I would hear all of this, all those Indians are drunks, all those Indians are lazy, all those Indians get everything for free. And then I go back onto my reserve and I would see the evidence. I thought I saw the evidence, but like I said, there was no one there to help me process all of this negative information. There's no one there to loss of parenting, no one there to say, Brad, sit down. You know why you see so much alcoholism? Well, there was this thing called the residential school for the last 150 years. You know why you see so much unemployment? Well, when Canada was formed, they forced us onto these things called the Indian Reserve, and they took away our ability to be self-sustaining. We weren't allowed to sell our fish. We weren't allowed to sell our vegetables. We weren't allowed to, create any businesses for ourselves. And we actually, once we got on the reserve, we needed this pass to leave the reserve. So when I look at all of these conditions, when I started to reconnect with myself, I started to connect the dots. I'm like, that's why my grandfather did this. That's why my grandmother never said this. That's why my uncles and aunties, everyone was affected in my community by the residential schools. And so I started to connect the dots and, learning about this and bringing back these memories of fire, those images that Amy just showed. It just brought a really, really, really warm feeling to me, and I'm very thankful for it. And, I thought about it and, my personal experience, I think most of our people's experiences, when you have a pebble in your shoe, right? The easiest way would be to take the pebble out. But sometimes if you can't take the pebble out, you just walk, and then you perhaps avoid that pebble, that pain, and then you just sort of walk on one side of your foot, or else you walk on the other side of the foot if it moves, right? And that's what I think about our people's experience and my personal experiences. I just adapted to this pain. Right. I knew there was this pain in my community. I knew there was this pain in my family, and I just adapted to it. I didn't try to make sense out of it. And unfortunately, when you do that, when that's your strategy through life, you avoid certain things. You don't strive for success. Your main focus is survival, whether that's, not physical, but emotional, psychological survival, and so that's sort of how I sort of moved my way through life, is just I adapted to that pebble, right? So that's why I really love doing these workshops, and I love bringing it to Canadians' history. I love bringing this history to Canadians' consciousness. And, fortunately, I've spoken in Ottawa. They flew me out there to speak to, it just blows my mind. Like here you have this young Indian boy from northern BC, grew up, self-esteem was shot because of the historical trauma, at age 7. So, and here I am speaking in front of Ottawa, for some pretty important people. So it's just, it's fire across the land. You just want to bring the fire and spread it across the land in a good way, right? So thank you for having me. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm going to stick around with Tara, Amy, and Shyann. Thank you.